So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about the rapier briefly. And mostly what I wanted to point out is that they can cut. A lot of people, there's a lot of myths about the rapier. One is that they're light and they're flimsy. That's not true. Another thing is that people say, well, it's only for thrusting. I think what they're confusing it with is the weapon that came after this, which was the small sword, or the training analog for that, which later developed into the fencing foil. Of course, back at the time, it was simply known as the foil because sport fencing didn't exist. There was just fencing, what we would call nowadays historical fencing. But these two things are very different. A fencing foil is incredibly light. It's very sort of dainty and slim in construction. A rapier has a slim blade in this profile, but the blade is fairly long, and the hilt is fairly robust, and there's a good pommel. And well, what you end up with is a sword that weighs about as much as an arming sword. These can weigh anywhere from 2.5 to 3 pounds, and that doesn't tell the whole story because the thing is they're not held like an arming sword. Most medieval swords, the guard positions are retracted. You're holding it back here, or you're holding it down until you actually strike. The only real forward position that medieval swords have is long point. But that's one position, right? Whereas, you have positions that are downward, or up here, or back here, or back here, like with sword and buckler. So the sword is held close to your body, and that's because there's no complex hilt to protect your hand. If you hold it out, somebody's going to chop your arm. The whole sword is held close to the body with a medieval sword, so that's not as difficult as holding it out at arm's length. So not only does this weigh as much as a, let's say, arming sword, potentially, there was a variety of weights, but they were not light, generally speaking. Not only does this potentially weigh as much as an arming sword, but you're holding it in a way that's more tiresome than the way you'd hold an arming sword, namely out at arm's length. Yeah, so these were not light. They also could cut, and it was important that they be able to cut because, you had to face a variety of conditions and opponents with one of these. There were still many other types of swords in civilian use that you could potentially encounter. And then the idea, if you encountered more than one person, what would you do? With a thrust-only weapon, you can only attack in a straight line. With something like this, you can cut, deal with that person, come back to this one. Similarly, if your blade is directed offline, you go to thrust and it's displaced, you just bring it around and cut the person. Because the blade on this is heftier than that on a small sword, and also longer. Small swords typically had around 32-inch blades or something, 31-inch blades. This has a 37-inch blade, and this is a short rapier. So even the short rapier has a blade that's 7 inches longer than a small sword. It's also wider and has more mass in it. So here's the deal. If your blade gets pushed offline and you go to disengage, it's going to be slower and more awkward with a sword like this than it would be with a small sword. Rather than disengage, if when your sword gets pushed offline, if you could just bring it around and cut the guy, I got to watch the ceiling here, but bring it around and cut the guy, that works, right? And then follow it up with a thrust or something. So being able to cut is important because they made the blades really long in order to be more effective at thrusting and give you an advantage in reach. But then, because they're really long, they're heavier, they're a little more cumbersome than the later period small sword. So your blade gets pushed offline, disengaging is a little more difficult. So when your blade gets pushed offline, just bring it around and cut, right? Or similarly, if you thrust and you miss, you do a push cut or a pull cut on the way out, and then you're ready to thrust again. So the whole idea that these things couldn't cut, it's largely a myth. I think what people are doing is they're confusing it with the later period small sword, most of which couldn't cut. There were some exceptions that had, flattened diamond section or lenticular blades, but generally speaking, the small swords had a triangular hollow ground blade, similar to a modern epee, and they had a wicked point, but they couldn't really cut with the edges. You could hit somebody, but it wasn't going to cut them. Again, there were exceptions, but that was the rule. It's the opposite with the rapier. The exception was there were some rapiers that either couldn't cut or had blades too thin and slender to be effective at cutting. But the vast majority of rapiers could cut to one degree or another, and cuts were used heavily in most rapier treatises, or I should say more heavily than most people think, because of course there are variations. But yeah, as a rule, this was a cut and thrust sword. It was just optimized for the thrust. So, Lone Rider out.